The smell of olive wood smoke is filling a courtyard carved into a limestone hillside in Nazareth, Galilee, around 6 BC. A young Jewish woman named Miriam is kneeling over a grinding stone, crushing barley into rough flour for her family's daily bread. You know her as Mary, and what she actually cooked every day for the boy who would become the most famous person in history looked nothing like the lavish banquet scenes from Renaissance paintings. So why did the food of a subsistence farming family, people living on the ancient equivalent of $4 to $6 a day, shape some of the most important moments in the entire Bible? Nazareth, Galilee, roughly 6 BC. If you'd walked through this village back then, you would have missed it entirely. Archaeologists estimate the place covered about 4 acres, roughly 3 soccer fields pushed together, with maybe 50 houses crammed along a limestone hillside. The population sat somewhere between 200 and 1,000 people, depending on which excavation team you believe. That's fewer people than a single floor of a modern Manhattan apartment building. Everyone knew everyone, there were no strangers, and every family survived by working the terraced hillsides, tending small garden plots wedged between rocky outcroppings, and bartering at the market in nearby Sepphoris, an hour's walk to the northwest. This was Mary's world. And the center of that world was her kitchen. Now, erase whatever image just formed in your head. A first-century Galilean kitchen was a shared courtyard between 2 or 3 connected stone houses, open to the sky, with a clay oven called a tanur standing about waist-high in one corner. These tanur ovens have been found across the Levant at dozens of archaeological sites, and they all look roughly the same. A beehive-shaped dome made from clay mixed with straw and animal dung, heated from inside with dried animal dung, thorny scrub brush and olive wood trimmings. The smoke from that fuel is what you'd smell first if you stepped into Mary's courtyard. But this is where things get interesting, because the food that came out of that simple courtyard kitchen was more connected to the stories of the Bible than you've ever realized. Feel the heat radiating off that tanner oven. The interior is somewhere around 700 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to blister bare skin on contact. The clay walls glow orange near the base. Mary's hands are calloused and cracked from years of slapping wet dough against those scorching walls and peeling flatbread off before it burns. She does this every morning before the Palestinian sun turns the courtyard into a furnace. And this is where every single day in the household begins. Bread. If you want to understand what Mary cooked for Jesus, you start and end with bread. The Hebrew word for bread, lechem, literally means food. Bread wasn't something served alongside the meal. Bread was the meal. Everything else was a way to make the bread more interesting. A first-century Jewish family in Galilee consumed between 1 and 2 pounds of bread per person per day. For a household of 5 or 6 people, that's 8 to 10 pounds of bread daily, the equivalent of baking roughly 12 full loaves every single morning. And Mary didn't buy flour. She made it. Every day, before anything else, Mary knelt on the hard ground in front of a saddle quern, a flat basalt stone base with a smaller grinding stone on top. She poured dry grain into the hollow center and pushed the upper stone back and forth, crushing wheat or barley kernels into rough flour. Archaeologists who've replicated this process say it produces about 1 pound of usable flour per hour of continuous grinding. Your arms would be burning after 15 minutes. Mary did this for 1 to 2 hours every morning for decades. Put your hand flat on a table right now. Feel how smooth it is. The saddle quern was nothing like that. It was carved from volcanic basalt, and after years of daily use, it wore grooves so deep you could fit your thumb inside them. Archaeologists have found these worn-out querns discarded across first-century Galilean villages, each one a silent record of thousands of hours of women's labor that never made it into a single gospel. But here's the detail that everyone misses about this bread. The flour Mary ground was coarse, grainy, speckled with bran and germ. She mixed it with water, a pinch of salt, and if she'd saved a lump of fermented dough from yesterday's batch, she kneaded that in too, creating a simple sourdough. Then, she shaped the dough into flat rounds about 8 inches across and slapped them against the inside walls of the hot tanur. 3 minutes later, she pulled the bread off the clay wall. The underside was bubbly and slightly charred, the top soft, pliable, steaming in the morning air. Imagine the smell, something more primal than bakery bread, smoke, toasted grain, a hint of char, and the mineral tang of heated clay. This is what Jesus smelled every morning of his childhood growing up in Nazareth. This was the first taste of every single day. And this bread wasn't just food. It was the plate, the fork, and the spoon all at once. There was no tableware in a first-century Galilean home. You tore a piece of flatbread, folded it between your fingers, and used it to scoop whatever else sat in the communal dish at the center of the floor mat. The entire family gathered cross-legged on woven mats around a single clay bowl, dipping and scooping together, hands overlapping in the same dish. This is where the concept of breaking bread comes from. It wasn't a metaphor, it was every Tuesday night in Nazareth. So what was actually in that communal bowl? Most mornings the answer was olive oil. You tore your bread and dipped it in a shallow clay dish of cold-pressed olive oil, maybe sprinkled with dried za'atar, a blend of wild thyme, oregano, sesame seeds, and sumac that still grows on the Galilean hillsides today. Olive oil was everything in first-century Palestine: cooking fat, lamp fuel, soap, medicine, skin moisturizer. A family's olive oil supply was as critical as a modern family's electricity bill. Run out of olive oil, and your house went dark, your food was flavorless, and your skin cracked like old leather in the dry Mediterranean wind. On better mornings alongside the bread and oil, Mary might set out a handful of brined olives from a clay storage jar, some crumbly white cheese made from goat's milk, or a few dried figs from the tree growing in the courtyard. That was breakfast. That's what the Son of God ate at 6 in the morning. And this is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because the mid-morning snack that Mary packed for her family reveals something about the Bible that you've probably read 100 times without catching. Imagine mid-morning on a hot Galilean day. The sun has been up for 4 hours. The temperature is pushing past 90 degrees. Joseph is working, either building with stone and wood in the village or walking the terraced hillside fields. The children need something to sustain them through the heat. Mary pulls out more bread, and alongside it, she serves roasted grain, parched wheat or barley heated in a dry clay pan until it pops and turns golden. This was the ancient equivalent of granola. Quick, portable, calorie-dense. You've read about this exact food before. Ruth ate it in the Book of Ruth, dipping roasted grain in vinegar during the barley harvest alongside Boaz's field workers. Listen to the crunch of parched grain between your teeth. It sounds like someone stepping on dry autumn leaves, nutty, toasty, faintly sweet. With a few dried dates pressed into sticky clusters, this simple snack could power you through hours of physical labor in the Galilean sun. Mary also kept a jar of date syrup in the house, the thick, dark, intensely sweet liquid made by boiling dates until they dissolved into caramel-colored concentrate. A few spoonfuls stirred into a cup of water made a sweet drink that children loved. Think of it as the ancient version of stirring chocolate powder into a glass of milk. Mary almost certainly gave this to the young Jesus, sweetening his water on hot afternoons in the Nazareth courtyard. That date syrup, by the way, is the honey mentioned throughout the Hebrew Bible. When God promised Israel a land flowing with milk and honey, the original audience didn't picture golden bee honey in a jar. They pictured this dense, dark, sticky date syrup. The promised land's sweetness was date syrup on warm bread. That was the taste of divine abundance. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything about how Jesus talked about food later in his ministry. The real meal, the one that defined Mary's cooking, came at sundown. The evening meal was the only hot food most families ate all day, and in that meal, you find the recipes that shaped Jesus's palate for 30 years. Imagine a clay cooking pot in Mary's courtyard, round-bottomed and blackened from years of use, sitting on a bed of glowing olive wood embers. Inside, red lentils are bubbling slowly, breaking apart into a thick, creamy, rust-colored porridge. Mary has added diced onion, crushed garlic, a handful of chopped wild greens like mallow or chicory gathered from the hillside, and a generous pour of olive oil. The The seasonings are cumin and coriander seed, both crushed between two flat rocks, and maybe a pinch of dried hyssop, an herb with a flavor somewhere between mint and parsley. The whole courtyard fills with the smell of roasting spices and simmering legumes. This is the same stew from Genesis, the red pottage that Esau sold his entire birthright for. That story wasn't exaggeration. If you'd been hauling limestone blocks since dawn, hungry enough to feel your hands shaking, and you walked into a courtyard where this lentil stew had been simmering for 2 hours, you'd understand the desperation. The smell alone could make you lightheaded. Earthy, warm, with that deep cumin funk and the sweet sharpness of slow-cooked onions caramelizing in olive oil. Esau traded his entire inheritance for a bowl of this, and honestly, after a day of hard labor in the Galilean sun, you might have too. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense to people today. Mary served the stew in a single large bowl placed on the ground mat. The family gathered around it. You tore your bread, scooped the lentils, ate with your fingers. One bowl, one family, every hand reaching into the same dish. This physical intimacy of eating, fingers overlapping in shared food, was a nightly ritual in every home in Nazareth. When Jesus later said, "The one who dips bread with me in the bowl" at the Last Supper, he was describing something he'd done 10,000 times at his mother's table. That wasn't a symbolic gesture. That was muscle memory from a lifetime of family dinners. But lentil stew wasn't every night. Mary rotated through a small set of dishes based on what was available, what was in season, and what she could afford. Chickpea paste, what we now call hummus, made by mashing boiled chickpeas with olive oil, garlic, and ground sesame. Archaeologists have traced chickpea cultivation in the Levant back over 7,000 years. Mary's version wouldn't have been the smooth, blended hummus you buy in a plastic tub at the grocery store. It was chunkier, grainier, spread thick on flatbread or scooped up with raw cucumber slices and wild herbs. Broad beans, slow-cooked with cumin and dill until they collapsed into a thick, savory mash. This was peasant food, poor people's food, but it was filling, and the beans grew easily in the rocky Galilean soil and could be dried and stored for months through the winter. Step inside Mary's storage room for a moment. Feel the cool air against your skin. This small chamber, cut partially into the limestone bedrock beneath the house, stayed naturally cool year-round, maybe 15 degrees cooler than the courtyard above. This was the closest thing Mary had to a refrigerator. Against the walls, you'd find large clay storage jars sealed with lids and cloth. One filled with dried lentils, another with dried broad beans, a tall, narrow jar packed tight with olives curing in brine, the salt solution keeping them edible for months. Bundles of dried herbs hung from wooden pegs driven into the stone walls, filling the room with a faint, dusty scent of oregano and thyme. Strings of dried figs and dates dangled beside them, dark and sticky, slowly concentrating their sweetness as the moisture left them. This storage room was Mary's insurance policy against bad seasons. If the rains failed, if a crop was poor, if a family member fell sick and couldn't work the fields, these dried and preserved provisions were the difference between eating and going hungry. Managing this room, knowing how much to store and when to use it, was a skill as essential as the cooking itself. On nights when fresh vegetables were available from the garden, Mary might prepare stewed squash dressed with olive oil and vinegar, or a salad of wild purslane and mallow leaves tossed with salt and oil. These wild greens grew freely across the Galilean hillsides, free for the picking, and they were a critical source of vitamins for families who couldn't afford much variety from the Sepphoris market. And then there was fish from the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth sat only about 20 miles from the Sea of Galilee, roughly a full day's walk. Dried and salted fish from the lake's massive fishing industry was traded inland across the entire region, and it was one of the few animal proteins a family like Jesus's could regularly afford. The most common species was a type of tilapia, what's now called St. Peter's fish. along with sardines and other small lake fish that were salted and dried in the sun along the Galilee shoreline. You could smell a fish trader approaching the village from a quarter-mile away. That sharp, briny, slightly funky smell of preserved fish was as familiar in first-century Galilee as the smell of coffee is in a modern office building. The fish arrived salt-crusted and stiff as a wooden plank, packed tightly in woven baskets that left brine stains on the trader's donkey. Mary would soak the dried fish in a clay bowl of well water for hours to soften it and pull out the excess salt, then cook it over the courtyard fire with sliced onions, wild herbs, and a splash of olive oil. The flavor was intense, much saltier and more concentrated than fresh fish, with a depth that came from weeks of curing in the Galilean sun. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of canned tuna, but with more bones and a much stronger personality. When Jesus chose fishermen as his first disciples on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, the men he called had spent their entire lives catching and preserving the exact same fish that Mary served at the family table in Nazareth: Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John. These were the men who salted and dried the tilapia that ended up 20 miles inland in villages like Mary's. The fishing industry and the dinner table were connected by a single supply chain that ran straight through the heart of the Gospels. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because it changes how you understand at least a dozen scenes in the New Testament. Meat was almost never on the table. This is the single biggest gap between what you imagine and what actually happened inside a first-century Galilean home. Butchering an animal was a major economic event. A goat, a sheep, even a chicken represented significant household wealth. Slaughtering one was like smashing open your savings account and spending it all in one afternoon. Families ate meat only at festivals, weddings, and religious celebrations, maybe 5 to 10 times per year, that's it. When meat did appear on Mary's table, it was almost always goat or lamb, never pork, which was forbidden under Jewish dietary law. The animal would be roasted whole over an open fire or slow-cooked in a stew with vegetables and wild herbs. The fat was saved and used for cooking in the days that followed. The bones were boiled into broth. The hide was tanned for leather. The sinew was dried and used as thread. In a world without refrigeration and without markets open 7 days a week, killing an animal was a commitment that rippled through daily life for weeks. So when the Gospels describe a fatted calf being slaughtered for the prodigal son's return, the original audience heard something very specific. That wasn't just dinner, that was a family liquidating an asset worth roughly 3 to 4 months of wages, somewhere around $6,000 in today's money, for a single meal. That's the scale of celebration the father chose, and it explains why the older brother was furious. That's how rare and how costly meat really was. I mean, think about that for a second. Every time you read a story about a feast or a banquet in the Bible, multiply the significance by about 50 compared to what a dinner party means today. These were not casual events. The drinks on Mary's table were equally simple. Water drawn from the village well or a nearby spring, stored in clay jars that stayed cool through natural evaporation. And wine, diluted with water at a ratio of roughly 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part wine, so weak it was closer to flavored water than anything you'd recognize as wine today. Children drank this diluted wine. Everyone drank it. Undiluted wine was considered uncivilized, something only Romans did at their worst. But there was one day every week when Mary's cooking changed completely, and it reveals something about Jesus' childhood that almost nobody talks about: the Sabbath. Every Friday afternoon, Mary cooked double. She had to. Jewish law prohibited lighting a fire or cooking on the Sabbath, which began at sundown Friday and lasted until sundown Saturday. So everything the family would eat for roughly 24 hours had to be prepared in advance. This is where Mary's cooking reached its peak. The Sabbath meal on Friday evening was the best food of the entire week. If there was any meat to be had, this is when it appeared. A roasted chicken if the family could afford one, or a slow-cooked lamb stew that simmered all Friday afternoon in the courtyard, filling the narrow lanes of Nazareth with an aroma that made the whole village start counting the minutes until sundown. But even without meat, the Sabbath meal was special. Mary would bake extra bread, finer bread, using her best wheat flour instead of the coarser barley she might use during the week. She'd prepare a version of cholent, a slow-stewed dish of beans and grain and root vegetables that was assembled before sundown and left to cook over dying embers through the night, staying warm and edible into Saturday. She might set out a dish of fresh fruit, pomegranate seeds scattered like rubies across a clay plate, or clusters of grapes arranged beside sliced figs. The olive oil would be the best quality she had, the first pressing golden and peppery. The Sabbath table was the one time each week when enough actually felt like more than enough, and the ritual around it mattered as much as the food itself. The Sabbath lamp was lit. Blessings were spoken over the bread and the wine. The family ate slowly, savoring, not rushing through the meal the way they did on workday mornings. This weekly ritual of deliberate abundance in the middle of an otherwise tight existence was one of the defining rhythms of Jewish life in the Galilean hill country. Jesus grew up inside that rhythm. Every Friday sundown, every Sabbath meal, every blessing spoken over broken bread in the courtyard. When he later declared himself Lord of the Sabbath, he was claiming authority over the most sacred weekly ritual of his entire childhood. That's not an abstract theological statement. That's a man redefining the dinner table he grew up at. If you've been watching this long, you're the kind of person who wants the deep cuts, the details nobody else covers. Hit subscribe so you don't miss next week's video. We're going even deeper into this world. Alright, so here's where things get really interesting. Let's talk about the spice rack, because even in a kitchen as simple as Mary's, seasoning was never an afterthought. The spices available in 1st century Galilee read like a map of ancient trade routes running through the region. Cumin, originally cultivated in Egypt. Coriander, grown across the Mediterranean basin since the Bronze Age. Black mustard seed, which grew wild on the Galilean hillsides and which Jesus himself later used as a metaphor for the kingdom of God. Dill, anise, and mint, which the Pharisees tithed so meticulously that Jesus called them out for counting individual herb leaves while ignoring justice and mercy, and hyssop, which carried both culinary and ritual significance, mentioned in the Torah as a cleansing herb used in purification ceremonies. These weren't exotic imports shipped from distant lands. Most of these spices grew within walking distance of Nazareth. Mary could pick wild za'atar from the rocky hillside above the village. She could harvest coriander from her own small garden patch beside the house. Cumin and mustard seeds she might buy at the Sephoris market, measured out in tiny clay scoops. But even those were affordable because they grew abundantly across the region. Reach into a jar of whole cumin seeds right now and bring them close to your nose. That warm, earthy, slightly sweaty smell is the backbone of Mary's cooking. It's the smell Jesus associated with home, with safety, with his mother calling the family to gather for the evening meal in the Nazareth courtyard, and the timing of what happened next with those spices. Almost too perfect. Because the 7 foods God promised Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates, those weren't aspirational. They weren't metaphors. They were the actual, practical, daily diet of families like Mary's. Every single one of those 7 species appeared on her table regularly through the year. The wheat and barley became the daily bread from the tanur. The grapes became wine diluted with well water. Figs and dates were dried and stored for year-round snacking. Pomegranates were cracked open and eaten seed by jeweled seed in the autumn harvest months. The olives were pressed into the oil that touched every single meal. This wasn't a land of luxury and surplus. It was a land of enough. Just barely enough in the right season when the rains came and the crops didn't fail. And Mary's skill, the skill of every 1st century Jewish mother in the Galilean hill country, was turning just enough into something that tasted like abundance. There's a reason the feeding of the 5,000 landed so hard for its original audience. 5 barley loaves and 2 dried fish, that's all. A child's packed lunch, barely enough for one person. And Jesus transformed it into a feast for 5,000 men, plus uncounted women and children, with 12 baskets of leftover bread fragments. The miracle isn't just the multiplication of food, it's the transformation of not enough into more than anyone could possibly need. That was the exact opposite of every meal Mary ever cooked in the Nazareth courtyard. She always started with, "Not enough." She just never had a miracle to solve the problem. She had skill, patience, and a saddle quern worn smooth from years of grinding. Now let's reconstruct one full day of eating in Mary's household. A complete day, from darkness to darkness, based on what the Mishnah and the Talmud and recent archaeological excavations tell us about ordinary Jewish family meals in the 1st century. Pre-dawn, in the Nazareth house, Mary wakes on a thin mat spread over the limestone floor, in total darkness. The rooster hasn't crowed yet. She feels her way across the cold stone to the grain storage pit, a clay-lined hole cut into the bedrock and covered with a flat stone to keep rats out. She scoops enough wheat berries to fill a medium clay bowl, maybe 2 cups worth, and settles at the saddle quern by the faint glow of an olive oil lamp. The rhythmic scraping of stone against stone is the first sound of every day in this house. Back and forth, back and forth. 90 minutes of grinding before the flour is ready. Dawn breaks over the Galilean hills. Mary adds water, salt, and a lump of fermented starter dough she saved from yesterday. She kneads the mixture on a flat stone surface, working it with her fists for 10 minutes until the dough turns elastic and smooth. She divides it into flat rounds and lights the tanner with dried brush and animal dung, the smoke rising through the open courtyard into the brightening sky. While the oven heats, she sets out the morning meal on a woven mat. A shallow dish of olive oil, a handful of brined olives from a storage jar, a few dried figs. She sends one of the younger children to the village well to draw water. The family gathers in the courtyard as the fresh bread comes off the tanner walls. Joseph tears the first piece and dips it in olive oil. The children follow. There's a simple blessing, a few quiet words thanking God for bringing bread from the earth. They eat quickly. Joseph leaves for work. The children scatter to their morning tasks. Mary wraps the remaining bread in a cloth-lined basket and stores it in the shade. She'll pull it out again in a few hours. Mid-morning comes with the rising heat. More bread, this time with roasted grain and a smear of date syrup for the younger children. Cool water from the clay jar. The older children are working, learning crafts from neighbors or studying Torah at the village gathering place. Mary begins preparing the evening meal. The afternoon is when the real cooking happens. Mary soaks red lentils in a clay pot filled with well water. She peels and chops onions with a bronze blade so dull by modern standards that she has to lean her full weight into each cut. She crushes garlic cloves with the flat of the blade against the stone floor. The cooking fire is rebuilt in the courtyard with fresh fuel, and the clay pot goes onto a ring of stones set above the glowing embers. She adds olive oil, then onions, then garlic, then the soaked lentils, then more water. She sprinkles in cumin and crushed coriander seed. The stew will simmer for 2 to 3 hours while Mary does other work nearby, mending clothes, spinning raw wool into thread, or weeding the small vegetable garden beside the house. Sundown arrives across the Galilean hills. The family gathers in the courtyard once more. The lentil stew is thick and fragrant, the color of rust, filling the evening air with the warm smell of cumin and caramelized onions. The morning's bread, slightly stiff now from sitting all day, gets warmed by laying it across the hot lid of the cooking pot. There might be a side of crumbled goat cheese, a few slices of raw cucumber, a cluster of grapes if they're in season. The family eats together from the single clay bowl, tearing bread, scooping stew with their fingers, passing the water jar hand to hand around the circle. Stories are told here, arguments happen, lessons are taught. This is the table where Jesus learned to listen, to question, to build the narratives that would eventually change the world. Every parable he later told about seeds and soil and harvest and bread and wine and banquets and wedding feasts. The raw material for all of it came from this courtyard, from this food, from watching his mother cook over a clay fire every evening. After the meal, Mary saves a lump of raw dough for tomorrow's sourdough starter. She scrubs the cooking pot clean with sand and water. She covers any leftover stew in a sealed jar. It will be tomorrow's mid-morning meal. She trims the wick of the olive oil lamp and refills it from the family's oil supply. The day's cooking is finished, and tomorrow, before the sun rises over the Galilean hills, she'll wake in the darkness and do the whole thing again. 2,000 years later, we're still eating what Mary cooked in that Nazareth courtyard. Flatbread, hummus, olive oil, lentil soup, dried figs, crumbled goat cheese. Walk into any Mediterranean restaurant anywhere in the world today, and you'll find a menu that Mary would immediately recognize. The recipes survived because they were perfectly adapted to their environment. Simple ingredients, minimal fuel, maximum nutrition, extraordinary depth of flavor. The dishes survived. But the woman behind them never made it into the history books, not as a cook. You'll find Mary in the nativity scene at the foot of the cross, in the upper room at Pentecost. You won't find her grinding grain at 4 in the morning, her forearms aching, her fingertips raw, shaping the 10,000th flatbread for a family that depended entirely on her hands. That labor, repeated every single day across decades, is the invisible foundation beneath the most important story ever told. And the flatbread she baked in that beehive-shaped clay tanner oven on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Nazareth? That's the bread Jesus was thinking of when he picked up a loaf at the Last Supper in Jerusalem, broke it in half and said, "This is my body." He wasn't thinking of bakery bread from a Jerusalem market stall. He was thinking of his mother's hands pressing dough against hot clay in the courtyard where he grew up. Next week, we're rebuilding the actual house Jesus grew up in, stone by stone, room by room, based on the latest archaeological excavations underneath the Sisters of Nazareth convent. The room sizes, the furniture, the sleeping arrangements, the storage pits carved into bedrock, all of it is completely different from what you've been told. Click the video on your screen right now, because the first 5 minutes alone will change how you picture every scene from the Gospels that takes place inside a house.